you're dealing in investing and in poker with a lot of problem solving.
One thing that I've noticed is that everyone thinks they've got the best idea and everyone thinks they're the greatest.
You need to use a lot of analysis, deductive reasoning, and sort of employ, I would say, probabilistic thinking.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. What's up, guys? Today we've got a guest straight off the corporate streets of sorts, one of the top executives, managers. You're going to have to explain exactly what you do, but someone who's really crushed, I would say, appropriately crushed in the corporate world, in the real estate, not real estate, excuse me, private equity world, and also one of the highest stakes gamblers in poker there is. He plays enormous stakes with myself and other top poker players all the time. 3K, 6K, 100K buy-ins, no big deal. 200K buy-ins, whatever. He's also winning on Hended Mob and he's doing pretty well in poker, I understand, and in life. Philip Sternheimer, aka Mannheim. Is that your nickname, Mannheim?
There are many nicknames, more than you probably have, but
Really?
Mannheim was one of them, yes.
What other nicknames are there? I did not know this at all.
Well, my mom always used to say that a nice child has many nicknames. There's German Phil. In college, they called me Eurotrash, or they would
Oh
say
yeah,
Eurotrash.
which trash?
ET, go home. And there's other ones that are not appropriate for the stream. But Mannheim is one of them. Yes.
I like Euro Trash. I wish I had a nickname like Euro Trash.
Yeah,
I
but you
over
have it. I mean, you have one of the best nicknames of all time, so you're not the one to complain.
Thank you. Well, I'm greedy with my nicknames. I like to have many names. We gave you a nickname called Prince Philip in the high stakes cash games because you requested, for example, Diet Coke in a can and pour it in the cup. I remember this specifically. I mean, this one. I mean, to be fair, I have Diet Coke in a can myself quite a lot. Uh, but I remember I thought I was really peculiar with my food, but this I feel less odd about it myself. Um,
I have many special requests, I will admit.
all right, well, yeah, I think it's funny. Tell us a little bit about what you do, because I don't think that a lot of the people in poker understand what private equity is, but I can draw a parallel between private equity and poker. I know that you work for H&F, a very big company in the private equity scene. I don't know what it focuses on exactly, what sector, maybe multiple sectors. Why don't you explain a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, because took you quite a while to sort of describe it at the beginning. It's probably like someone who's trying to describe what you do in poker. So if you're not in it, so private equity, private meaning that the companies that we own are typically private and they're owned by us. That stands in contrast to public, which is a company that's listed in the stock market. And equity is considered and it's part of the capital structure, and that most companies have equity, which is the people that own the company, and then there's debt. And so typically when you have debt, you just have the rights to that kind of piece of funding, but you actually don't own the company, you don't run the company. So that's kind of public. You have equity and debt, and then you have public and private. So most companies we own, and most companies, when we own them, they are private and owned by us, typically together with management, and sometimes you have other investors involved. So the way our business model works is that we raise money mostly from either sovereign nations that invest to meet their long-dated obligations, such as paying pensions and salaries. So that could be like the government of Singapore is a very big investor in the space and with us, or it could be pension funds. So like the state of California, for example, or it could be university endowments. And there's some high net worth individuals as well, but you're probably 90% of our investors fall into those categories: university endowments, states, or sovereign nations. And then we ourselves are actually our biggest investor. So we care a lot about alignment of interest, and so one part of that is eating your own cooking. So having your own capital at risk. And so we raise funds typically with a sort of period over 10 years or 12 years. From those funds, we typically make investments into companies. I would say on average 10 to 15 companies per fund, where we typically make control investments. So we would be the sole owner of the company. Um, and over a period of, call it, the average being 6 years, but it can be as short as 1 year at the extreme and as long as 15. We would then own these companies and then ultimately sell them. And from the profit, we would take a certain share, which is typically 20%. Um, and that's effectively our business model. And of
Okay.
course, that sort of really only works with the mechanics that you have is if the company performs a lot better at the time when you sell it relative when you bought it. So there's a lot of focus on what I would call company building, which is just making the company do things that it didn't do before operationally, and there's a lot of building on sort of the company itself in terms of bringing in better management and sort of trying to drive what I would broadly call organizational excellence. So you might, what's our strategy, what's our purpose in society, or as a corporation, how do you drive real accountability, and how do you drive alignment of interest, and that's kind of a very big theme for us. So we typically make managers big shareholders as well, and we try to sort of bridge what is usually a very big gap in the public sector when the shareholders actually aren't and the managers are sitting in sort of separate boats. And we actually try to create an environment where both management and us think and act like owners. And so we try to therefore make decisions that are in the long-term interest of the company, and that typically leads to better results than on average.
Okay. I more or less understand. It sounds like basically you cooperate with companies and invest in ones that you think you can benefit, and there's like you can add some strategic value to, or you loan them money or something like that. I still don't know which exact companies. I remember you saying something about university loans, perhaps, or am I just totally
No,
off?
I mean, I think as you said, we happen. So there's firms with different focuses. There's some private equity firms that are only focused on technology or software, for example. There are some that are focused only on consumer companies. We happen to invest across a variety of industry sectors, but within that, we have a focus on trying to buy, I would say, good or very good business franchises. So there's some that only do turnarounds. They buy sort of broken businesses, but they buy them relatively cheap. So we would look to buy good businesses and then try to make them even better. And
Okay.
it
Well,
tends
yeah.
to operate on the larger end of the scale in terms of the size of companies. So that's another differentiation. So private equity typically is more mature businesses. As you go further down, sort of the younger company stage, you get into growth equity, and at the very early end, you get into venture capital.
Right. Okay. I'm trying to think of how to explain this to the poker audience, but it sounds like, generally speaking, you prefer companies that have already succeeded and to make them better, which would be like investing in a good player and say we're going to put you in this game and buy a share, or we're going to teach a good player how to play PLO and like take a share, like kind of thing. As a parallel for that, and something like venture capital would be, because I've done some venture investing myself, but venture capital would be like staking, or like would it be like staking? It would be like I mean, the gamble of venture capital reminds me a lot of gambling in a tournament. If I'm really honest, it doesn't really remind me of staking. Staking is actually riskier, but maybe it would be more like staking for you because you'd be like trying to help the company grow and that kind of thing and investing your time and resources. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I think the tournament would be more akin to venture capital, just given the payoff profile, and that you have a lot of times. So it's a riskier endeavor, where you would have a couple of times when you lose your money, but then you have some moderate payouts, and then you have once in a while a very big payout, and so that's in venture in private equity where we have a much more concentrated portfolio of 10, 15 bets, um, businesses that are more mature, therefore more analyzable and also more stable and more established. So our business model relies on hitting some singles and doubles, ideally not losing money ever, and then having also a couple of home runs, but probably fewer than what you would have in venture capital.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I understand. Is that one thing that's different between what you do and in poker is it seems like most of the time you're winning, whereas if you're playing a cash game, I mean, you can be pretty certain that you're a favorite, but you don't win most of the time. You win about half the time. You could say something like that. Like unless it's a
Yeah,
really big
it will
game.
be similar over a longer. So our minimum investment, our typical investment period is sort of 5 to 6 years. So, and one of the big benefits that private equity has is that you can really pick your timing of exit if you do everything right. So it'll be more like playing, backing a winning player, working with that winning player to become better, and then essentially deciding at which playing sort of a 5 year long cash game every day, and then deciding at what point you decide to exit. And probably if you pick the right poker player with the right mentality and help them get better, and we're sort of like not maybe pick sort of the timing at the end of a downswing, for example, or when the multiples of what the market is willing to pay for that player happens to be sort of very out of favor, you would then essentially decide, you shouldn't. If I was to be backing you, Jungle, if I put you in the right games and we help improve some of your leaks in the game itself and mentally and whatnot, like you should actually be winning like almost always over a 5 year period, right?
Yeah,
And so that's
because
kind of really
that's a
the
problem.
the the probably better analogy.
Okay, okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. Uh, and yeah, not winning over a 5 year period is a little bit of a problem for playing poker. There's a couple other sorts of comparisons I have in mind. I would think, I mean, I think business is way more complicated for all sorts of reasons, but it's always sort of gambling just because you can never really, you can always go into all these little details and look at all the comparables, other similar kinds of businesses, or you look at, if you could look at like people that have done similar things and whatever, but you have to like kind of at some point decide like how much of it's worth your time. And then it seems like, I mean, why don't, before I give my thoughts, I want to hear, are there any more kinds of comparisons you can think of how it works with poker?
You mean between private equity and poker?
Well, what you do. I mean, I also have a follow up question of sorts because there is a major difference in. There's a couple major differences actually.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look at the similarities are that you're dealing in investing and in poker with a lot of problem solving, and you're dealing with imperfect information. And because you have imperfect information, you need to use a lot of analysis, deductive reasoning, and sort of employ, I would say, probabilistic thinking. Like we have when we look at a business, we sort of look. We have typically a base case, which is sort of the most likely case, but really then we think about what are the range of outcomes for the key bets that we're making, and a lot of times you have a downside case, you have a base case, you have an upside case, and so it's sort of similar to thinking about ranges, and it's ultimately probabilistic because, of course, there are no certainties in life, and because you have imperfect information, there is no kind of one outcome that it's that you can really think about. Um, and so that's kind of very similar. Um, there's a couple of differences in that. Um, One is, really, if you boil down investing, it does come down to kind of really game time decisions that you have around when we decide to invest money, when we decide to sell, and it also when you work with a company, when it really comes down to, there's fewer key judgments that you need to get right. Like what's the right management? What are the sort of 2 3 strategic priorities that are, if we get right, really sort of
Is there?
move the dial. In poker, you have this sort of ongoing micro decisions that you have all the time, and you sort of can't run away from them. In business, there's a lot of stuff where if I don't feel like making a decision today, I can generally also make it tomorrow. In
Really?
poker, like once you're sitting at the table, it's sort of right in front of you. Um, I do think then there's this. You also have like ultimately in investing, you have beta. So the stock market goes up effectively by 8% a year on average,
I don't
while in
think the
poker you
audience
have
knows what beta is usually. I presume by beta you mean like basically the stock market goes up. You're probably going to go up too if you're invested in the business. Is that what you're saying?
correct. So we separate beta versus alpha. Alpha is essentially what we add on, if alpha is positive on top of that,
Okay.
while in poker, the beta is negative effectively because the rake and all kinds of other factors are working against you. Um, What's interesting is that in poker, you have a much more visceral understanding between, or direct understanding between the role of luck and skill. And I actually don't think it's different in business, but it gets obfuscated a lot more. I mean, I think people underappreciate the role of variance, the role of luck, and what they can control or not control. And I think I think it's no less true in life than it is in poker. But in poker, you have a very you can actually determine the difference between expectation and sort of results. Um, and so what it's taught me for investing is that like focus on the quality of the decision and focus less on outcomes in the short term, because you can't control outcomes, but you can control quality of decisions. And I think poker teaches you that in sort of a very visceral way. I would say the last difference is that, especially in investing, the type that we do, and when people say finance, it's such a big term. It's almost like games of chance and poker. Like, there's many different forms. In the form that we do that I just described, when we have sort of a very small basket of companies where we have a lot of our own money invested, and management does as well. Um, the uh, the ability to work with people and to influence them to make the right decision is, of paramount importance. Well, there's some overlap, of course, in terms of the study of the human mind and, being able to spot deception and whatnot. But, you don't really work in poker that way with other people, and certainly not with your opponents. And so that sort of human element, I think, is actually quite different in business than it is in the game of poker.
To positively influence them, you mean you don't want to, you want to influence the people positively that you're working with. Is what you mean.
Yeah, and you just influence them. I mean, influencing is sort of a very loaded word, but a lot of business is about driving alignment. Like, there's no point in saying you think the company needs to do A, um, if kind of you don't actually have alignment with the CEO, with the management team. So we face that problem a lot of times, is that we happen to have a point of view of something that needs to get done, but it's worthless if management doesn't really buy into it, right? And so I call that influencing ultimately. And it
Right.
goes both ways. I mean, they influence us as much as we influence them.
Sure. Sure. I would presume that like people in a way. This is one. Well, I've got a couple questions. Uh, so first question. I'll get back to that one. I would think that influencing people kind of works like poker in a way in that you don't really know what people are going to do, but you can still, you can pick like the optimal strategy. And you can like kind of assign a percentage to that. I mean, you can look at their history to some extent, especially when you're hiring them. I would think that hiring them is kind of like the pre-flop of, or deciding who to hire is kind of like, or looking at the people is kind of like the pre-flop of private equity or venture capital or whatever. And then like after that's like the post-flop of how you talk to them and do you do what you're gonna say you're gonna do? Do you show up for meetings on time? And all that's like post flop stuff. All that's like the stuff that can matter a lot if you mess it up too much. But like before that, like the actual people, I presume, are like the key components. Does this make any kind of sense?
I think I kind of like the analogy. I mean, I like the analogy. I mean, I would say what I'm thinking a little bit as a pre-flop and flop and maybe even turn, because I always think about investing in that one thing is asset selection, which I think our firm is particularly good at, which is ultimately you're sort of a student of business and you sort of understand ultimately, well, things like what's really your value proposition, and how is it actually defendable over time. and what are the competitive dynamics in the industry that allow you to extract, to monetize that, or not. And so there's, I think we're just actually quite good at that, and we're quite good at assigning value at it because, of course, we need to price our capital and think about risk. But once you own a company, I think the single most important decision, if I can only do one thing, is absolutely the management you put in place to run them. And I think it's extraordinarily important. And this notion of a Superman management team or CEO or Superwoman doesn't exist. I think there's very few CEOs that would be exceptional, and no matter which company or circumstance you put them in. I think it's generally horses for courses. So what is actually needed for that company, for that team at that point in time, relative to the strengths and weaknesses and experiences that that person has had? And so that's an extraordinarily important decision. And getting that right, there's very few that will have a huge sort of impact on the outcome on the performance of the company. And so I think it's a great analogy. It might be pre-flop and flop at the same time, I would say, just because it's of such paramount importance.
Okay, sounds like a couple things are going on here. So it sounds like, firstly, it sounds like this business situation of sorts, the proposition of like whatever's going on in the sector or whatever seems to trump like the actual management team, and then after that, it's the management team. But within that, it's you pick the right management team. You don't pick like the guy who's got like the amazing credentials, and I could see that being like quite an easy trap because there's
Yeah,
I mean, you could hire like the Phil Ivey or whatever, and Phil Ivey will know his worth, right? And he'll be like, I'm worth a lot of money. I'm Phil Ivey, so you got to pay up, and then you'll pay like a massive premium for a guy who's great at everything, but he's not like amazing when you need him for like short deck or I don't know, like Doogie or something like that. When you should have actually done is hire some Badoogie specialist or the Badoogie team and some I don't know people with software or like something like that, and like hired them for way cheaper and had them just like crush like this Badoogie spot. Does that make sense?
yeah, I know. I think that's right. And life is also is life is just business is just very it's just very complex. Um, and so, but it's I think it's an apt analogy. And of course, we try to get the business right, and we try to get management right. We have this philosophical debates: does management trump business or not? Right? Sort of like, would you rather have a bad company with a great management team, or vice versa? And ideally, we never face that problem. And so I don't even want to opine on it. But if our objective is to get both right, and you almost think
Of
about them
course.
independently.
We'd rather succeed at everything. Well, I would presume you would still have a bad management team for like crypto when it's booming, than you would like a great management team when it's going down. If that makes sense, because they can't exactly do anything when crypto is going down. That was my understanding. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and we would just not, I think a key part we call the circle of competence, which is that what is actually analyzable and where can we add value. And so the reason why we as a fund wouldn't invest in crypto is because I'm not sure we can add a lot of value. Of course, there's many business models centered around crypto, so maybe something like a Coinbase would be different because that's more like an exchange and whatnot. And so we've invested in exchanges, but like fundamentally, like we look at crypto and we just don't believe that we understand it well enough that it fits sort of the parameters that we put around investment, which is thou shalt not lose money, for example. And so that would just not be within our circle of competence ultimately.
Okay.
It might be
Yeah,
for other people, but it's not for us.
that makes a lot of sense. Is it accurate to say Is it accurate to say the business sector is kind of like the fundamentals of private equity and venture capital, but that in private equity and venture capital, like it's far broader. It's not like there's like one thing that works. It's like there's like just fundamentals of you can kind of select the zone in which you play the fundamentals for it's like you're selecting the game, I guess you could say. Whereas like you know that you're not that good at a triple draw, but you know you're really good at no limit. So you're like, all right, let's go into no limit. Or does that make sense?
I think what I'm probably answering the question a different way than what you thought, but this notion of fundamental is kind of helpful in that. So fundamental investing, there is very technical investing, for example, where it's kind of like you see people looking at screens and charts and what's not, and that's kind of, I think that's also what a lot of people are doing when they trade, for example, crypto or its variants. And that's one way to make money. I personally do not profess to understand it. When we say fundamental is like, sort of really comes down to like basic questions like, is this business actually have a superior value proposition to the customer that will make them come back to it, that will allow them to charge more than the next
Oh, I
guy.
see.
That's what I mean by fundamental
Yeah, yeah.
ultimately. And
Oh, this is
so private equity is at the mature, bigger companies, mature end of the spectrum. They typically have been around for a long time. They're proven to a certain extent. They're more analyzable. What we also do, we use leverage to fund our purchases. So we put a lot of our own money in, but we also borrow. So borrowing when you invest amplifies the return both ways. So it means like if you do well, you make even more. If it's not going well, you get wiped out faster. And so inherently, you should be only using leverage if you are looking at things that are somewhat more stable and somewhat more analyzable. Because of course, if things weren't to go well, um, you know, then leverage is very bad. And so the reason why, you might invest in something like crypto, that'll be much more apt to venture capital, where you typically wouldn't use leverage because it's so volatile. And when things are volatile, you don't want leverage. And so certainly I think we can all agree that crypto, where you can have price swings of a couple of months of minus 50%, like it's not a good asset class to put leverage to borrow money against or to put leverage on.
okay. This sounds more like trading. I didn't think that that was like your main focus in this kind of thing. It sounds
It is not, right? I mean, trading also, think about what your whole period for something that you trade is typically not 5 years, right?
yeah, yeah. That's what I thought. It looks like you more look for like solid fundamentals and long term investing and like. I mean, yeah, it sounds like you're looking for things that actually add value overall to people and try to get them while they're low or that sort of thing and help them become better products or put out better products. That sort of thing is. It sounds roughly right. I don't know 100% know what I'm talking about, but I feel like I'm
You're, you're,
kind of
get- you're getting it right.
all right, cool. That's good to know. Um, I have to ask, do you like working more in finance or do you like poker more? Would you rather become like a poker player if you had the choice of like, I mean, you wouldn't make as much. I can promise that. In comparison to whatever you're making in finance, finance is way bigger than poker. But it sounds, in a way, it sounds way more interesting, um, depending on what you're doing.
Well, there's a certain aspect of grass is greener, of course. And so I've never played poker for a living like you and many others have. So do I currently have more fun playing poker than being at work? I think probably, yeah. Um, does that mean therefore that playing poker for a living is more fun than what I do? Like, I don't know, right? So that's kind of maybe, um, so I think it's difficult for me to really realistically compare the two. I think the problem with poker, and I'd be curious how you think about it, uh, Dan, is that first of all, I love kind of the team aspect of private equity and the community that we have at work. I mean, really, I have lifelong friendships would be an understatement in terms that I made it work, and I think I've grown a lot as a person. I spend more time at work than I do with my friends and my family, right? So I think that's kind of a huge choice, and I really like the team aspect around it. The thing with poker is that other than some form of study groups that you have, it's pretty lonely sport, right? Sort of, in fact, not just that, but you're also out to get other people's money. Um, um, and then I don't know, there's just something around the zero sumness of it, right? Where um, if you even leave the rake aside, it is sort of a bit of a zero sum activity. And so if I was to do it for a living, I'd be asking myself in terms of how could I create purpose other than just being a great poker player and winning and whatnot. Um, and so that's kind of what I struggle with in poker sometimes. What I love is the camaraderie I love competition, of course, and I love the game, and I love the camaraderie that you have when you sit at a poker table with people that are interesting, and there's banter, and you're competing, but you're also competing, and you know that maybe today I win and tomorrow you win, and we can actually both win. You know, maybe not against each other, but against others. And so I just love that camaraderie.
Mhm.
But at the heart, it is pretty much a solo sport still, right? And then at the heart, it
Yeah.
is a zero-sum game unless you build something on top of it.
Well, that's kind of what I've been struggling with in a way. That's also what's been interesting for me in investigating, realms like business and that sort of thing. Is like, how do I like find purpose here? Because it did effectively reduce to a rat race to me. I was actually thinking of this today. Is like, what is a rat race exactly? If I looked at it only in terms of money, then it reduced effectively to a rat race. And if I like, uh, yeah, I mean, finding purpose in it has been a bit tricky, but we'll discuss that later. Just because that's a whole nother barnyard, or what's the word? It's a whole nother thing. I actually was going to ask you because I wasn't sure. Uh, and first, I'd like to state that I mean I think that the whole fact that intrinsically business is like a group working together, and poker is more like dog eat dog, and it just has to be that at least the financial aspect has to be less than zero sum at some point. Even though it doesn't exactly work out that way uh, within like various circles. I mean, there's still lots of like there's still many points in which it has to, as you said, be less than zero sum. But I think that's the whole reason why, in terms of money, poker reduces as a what's it called, a reducting economy versus business, where which is like constantly going up. There's like it's becoming it keeps scaling essentially. All well, business on the whole, you can say, or like technology on the whole keeps scaling because it is more a process of people working together. I think it's really that main factor is really what drives those two things. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, business is such a big term, jungle, in terms of hard to sort of make hard to make a sort of overly generalized statement based on that. I think there's forms of business that are also zero sum and that don't add a lot of value to society.
Oh, sure, yeah. I
Um,
mean, like stealing, like like hacking people and
yeah,
that
but
sort of
even
stuff.
like trading in a way. I mean, look, I think that people that work in trading, the value add to society is around, establishing a market for something, and where there have to be winners and losers, and you provide liquidity such that people can sell and buy. And so there's a role of markets, of course, that we all benefit from, including myself. But that's not particularly sort of that's quite zero sum, right?
Yeah.
Well, the way I try to think about what we do is, one is that really sort of do what's right for the business in the long term and try to bridge this sort of gap that exists when some random hedge fund invests in something and then management doesn't actually own a lot of the company. They just essentially get to do make money whether they're good or not, which is what I really hate. When someone gets fired, a lot of times, like even when they did a crap job, they get paid like a big kind of like goodbye
So
bonus.
stupid.
And
It
so
shouldn't be that way.
we
I
try to sort
mean,
of have more of a system where if we do well, if the company does well, we all do well. And we should just act and think like owners and do what's best for the business, right? And so to me, that's a very purist sort of motivating force. And behind that, when we do well, our beneficiaries are, pension, someone's pension gets paid or some teacher's salary. And so I find that a bit more motivating. And there's a reason why. It's a much longer discussion why I would suggest we don't go in there. But if you look at the number of publicly traded companies out there, it's been shrinking a lot. And if you look at the number of companies under private equity ownership, it's been growing a lot. And there's many reasons for that. One of them is that I think as a form of governance, to think about in terms of oversight of companies, the private equity model, I think, is actually much superior to what is found a lot of times with companies that are traded in the stock market. And so, but the term business itself is just very broad. And so I think there's some business which I think has gotten rightfully a really bad rep also in broader society when it comes to distrust in corporations and business. And there's some that I think is just incredibly value adding. And you're right in that that's what I called beta before. Fundamentally, economies grow and the stock markets grow, and sort of almost without doing anything, businesses on average tend to grow. And that's that's of course a very positive externality that you don't have in poker.
Yeah, yeah. But I feel like it's a force of nature essentially. I feel like it goes even beyond. Yeah, I mean, not all businesses work that way, but like businesses that actually provide for society and that sort of thing, that are actually putting out products and services and that stuff. Um,
That stuff.
hmm?
I'm just teasing you.
I was gonna ask, do you like working with people a lot? Because I remember it seemed like it looked like a little bit of a mixed bag, and I can see. I mean, I've had a bit of experience, running a charity foundation and running this podcast. Actually, is sort of like running a small company, but I think I've got a lot to learn. Um, there's some similarities to it.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's a big question. I mean, the reality is it depends, right? And so, and I think that's why it's a good question to ask yourself. In my job, I get to work with people. Um, the people at my firm is, of course, that's the employer that I pick, and I've chosen to stay there for 16 years so far. Um, they are sort of the highest kind of level in terms of intelligence, integrity, decency, I would say, right? And so I got a lot of energy from that. Then we work with management teams, and there you have when you buy a company with an existing management team, of course you don't get to pick every single one of them, and there you get the whole range of sort of people. And I get pretty bummed out sometimes, like when people don't behave with decency or integrity. That kind of gets me really upset.
mhm.
I would say I sometimes also have limited patience for people that just aren't capable, and that's not a great quality to have. But I'm a bit of a have high standards for myself and for others, and so this is kind of where you then, and look, some of those people then, like the ones that aren't decent, like they're not going to stay in the company for very long, but maybe they'll be there for some period of time before you maybe change them. But that's hard. So sometimes you work with people that you probably they wouldn't be your friends, but you still actually try to make the best of it. And so it can be. I've definitely come home a couple of times and been very sort of sad or demotivated because I was working with people that were behaving in a way that that I probably wouldn't, or I wish they hadn't behaved that way. And so I guess the advice I would just give when it comes to that is this is of course life, and there's no. And by the way, what I think of behavior is also sometimes very subjective. So it's not like they're bad people. I just happen to not click with them. But this whole notion around who you surround yourself with as part of work, um, that's of course something that you can actually have you can make decisions about, right? In terms of which profession you want to be in. And what I would just recommend is that, like, my reflection is that we're much more products of our environment than we maybe admit to ourselves. We live sort of in a very individualistic society where sort of the role of self is sort of very strong and we are who we are, but I don't think that's the way it works. I think we are very much products of our environment.
Oh, for sure.
We're first of all
Because
products of our parents, like that sort of determines who we are to a great extent, and then we are who we surround ourselves with, and so those are things that we can make choices about, and it starts with the insight actually of understanding what do you react positively to, and what actually tends to bring out worse things in you, and being thoughtful around therefore how you make those decisions, I think can actually lead to a much higher quality life.
oh, for sure. No, I mean that's who you pick to be around is one of the most important decisions to make because it's just like uh, these. It's really hard to like willpower itself. There's all sorts of studies on this. Willpower itself is not that powerful
Mm.
in comparison to environment. I mean, you also like there's some kind of psychological term for structuring your environment in a way that aligns with what you want to do with your willpower. Like if you don't want to have like a lot of junk food around you when you're. I mean, it's the same thing, really. You don't want to have a lot of junk food around you when you're trying to like cut weight or eat healthy. It's all the same. I want to ask two kind of related questions. Firstly, poker. Would you pick the poker players to hang out with or the business people? And secondly, um, they're not 100% the same question, but secondly, do you think that the job that people do conditions their personality and their character a lot?
Mm. Um, I think that's a really tough. The first one's really interesting. I think it's hard to answer. The answer is I hang out a lot with both, but and by the way, a lot of poker players I'm friends with are sort of a little bit trying to get more into business or actually do a little bit like what I do, maybe more or less professional in poker or not. I have a lot more heterogeneity in poker. I would say the friends that I have in business tend to be more certain types of personalities and backgrounds, while in poker, there's a much broader slate of people. Like, you have your
So,
own category, jungle, for example, but
well, I'm the Spice Festival.
you
Uh,
you are definitely the Spice Festival, um, and so I just like to have both. What I like about poker is that I get a lot more diversity of anything, age, experience, personality than I typically have in business, right? And so I like that spice in my life. But so I'm hopefully I wouldn't have to pick sort of either or, and hopefully it's just and.
okay, well, you didn't really answer my question. Well, I guess you kind of did. It was like different categories, but I would think like business people like never miss meetings and are really reliable and I don't know, they're not really all over the place too much. Oh, excuse me. Like, so I just happened to be by shaking my chair. Um, that's my guess. But yeah, I'm really curious because you didn't answer the second question, which is does it shape someone's character? Because I'm not sure if it does. And I try to look at studies a little bit. I have my own thoughts, but I want to hear what your opinion is because I would just think like especially poker probably filters out a lot of people. Like, there's not so many people whose personalities can really like handle it, uh, and I think that's true for certain financial things. And I don't know,
Yeah,
like you have to be a certain way when you're in these jobs. Like you have to like show
yeah,
it.
yeah. I think there's a lot of it is just going to be selection bias. So certain types of people gravitate to a certain career as opposed to they become a certain way because they're in the career. That's
Oh yeah,
probably the bigger factor. But look, I do think that it definitely changes your character. The question is to what extent. I am a fairly pressure prompted, slightly more disorganized person by nature. Like I've done personality studies when I started to go into business 20 years ago, and then I did the same one again. And it changed in ways that I sort of expected. So by nature of my job, I needed to become a lot more organized in planning.
yeah.
And so I never used to be that way, but like that, and that has definitely now spilled over into some of my personal life. Like I was sending out a message before to a poker chat group about a tournament in February, and I remarked afterwards, I'm probably the only person on that in that chat that plans ahead to February, let alone for 48 hours. And so that's a little bit of the factor of my work where I need to plan for myself because my schedule impacts other people's schedules, and you need to align that. And so in that way, I do think it changes you. I wonder if it sort of more fundamentally changes like your characters. That's sort of a big word. I imagine it does. Um,
It's
but
kind of
it's
your character if you're organized. Like I also had the same thing. I'm not an organized person by nature, but I had to create some systems to become more organized and also just straight up become more organized, frankly, and like schedule my calls in advance and put things in a calendar and all this stuff. Many poker players don't have calendars. I was thinking an interesting experiment, but it'd probably be a little bit of a nightmare. Would be if we like switched roles, and you would have to. I think you would do. I don't know. I don't know what you think. I think you would think that would do better than I would do in your business. Is my guess. I think you'd be like have a little bit of a heart attack if I had to like show up to work and do your job for the day. Is that right?
well, it's a little bit unfair, right? Because I have a lot more. If your profession is poker, a lot more experience in poker than you do in mine. So it's an unfair comparison. But I'm
So
not sure what else you got going on in your life, Jungle. So who knows?
Well, I have some experience hiring and firing for my charity foundation. I have some experience like running. We didn't. I wouldn't say I'm like great at it. There's definitely some things that I'm really not great at. I didn't. It's quite complicated. But like as I've said, this podcast is basically like running a small business. I have to look at make sure I pay people right, make sure I treat people right, hire the right people, hire consultants, get together like a plan for how to develop this thing, stuff like that. Um, so it's been a cute little detour. Um, what made you choose finance?
Um, I wish I could give you an answer like that with some kind of uh, big career plan in place, but at the time didn't really know what private equity was. I noticed that I was working at a consulting firm, and I noticed that the smartest people were leaving to join private equity firms, and then I decided to sign up for some interviews as well. And I did really poorly and didn't get any job offer the first time, and then I spent more time understanding what it was and decided that it actually was really interesting because I didn't actually know anything in the beginning. And then I interviewed the next year, and then ended up getting a couple of job offers. But there wasn't a big there wasn't a big career plan, and I had no I wasn't a person that sort of read the Wall Street Journal when I was young or had kind of a lot of interest in investing or whatnot. I literally happened, I would say, semi serendipitously.
Oh, okay. Well, how did you get into mixed games? The mixed games are kind of tough, just because there's 11 games you have to play. Well, it's pretty hard to do that. What how'd you get into poker and then mixed games? Like, was there like some kind of process there? Or did you look at all of us and think, man, these guys must be pretty stupid, or they don't look too smart? This jungle guy, who knows about him?
That was a big part of it, yeah. I think poker was probably like sort of everyone. I played a little bit in college, and then what really accelerated for me is I lived in Vegas for 6 months in '04, which was sort of the height of the poker. When I remember when I set foot into Bellagio in May '04 was Andy Beal was playing um, Chip Reese and Ted Forrest in the upstairs, not even in Bobby's. It was the upstairs area at the in the high limit area of the Bellagio, and just it was just packed and bustling, and like Vegas was just crazy at the time because everyone was like in real estate making crazy amounts of money and whatnot. So I sort of started playing No Limit for most of the time until um, 2013, essentially. I think I was playing the 100K one drop in Vegas, and I busted like late on day two, and I was super tilted, as you can imagine. Um, and then I literally just signed up for the next tournament that was available, which was a 10 game tournament, and I final tabled that, having not played I think 4 to 10 games before. Um, and sort of that a little bit sort of gave me the taste for it. I then didn't suddenly just only play mixed games after that, but I sort of played more mixed game tournaments. I actually didn't play cash, I did a little bit of studying, which at the time consisted mostly reading of books because there weren't many materials out there of any kind. Um, and then somehow ended up playing pretty high stakes early, I think 18, and then ran that up and had sort of enough for one buy-in in the big game in Bobby's, and then had a very successful summer, and then sort of never looked back. And of course, I was a lot worse back then than I realized at the time, which shows you about the variance in poker. But I also think that it's for people that only played No Limit before. You probably would curious how you thought about it, but there is a lot. It's just very portable in terms of your card sense and your ability to understand one game that sort of translates into asking the right questions for the next game. And so I do think your learning path is very accelerated if you're good at one game before and then switch to mixed games. And I just think it's just a lot more fun. I mean, I think that I like the stimulation in terms of different muscles that are being sort of tapped into. I like the fact that the games are less solved, which I think makes it easier to compete at the elite level. I mean, I think that for me to compete at the elite level in No Limit is very different than it is in like playing 11 games like we do in our game in Bobby's. And I think that's because some of the games are generally there's less interest in them, they're less solved, and I think that makes it easier to sort of get up the curve on a relative basis. But I'm curious how you think about it.
No,
I just
that's
think it's
true.
more fun. Like there's less tanking and there's more
Oh yeah.
camaraderie. Like I don't know, it's just like the whole vibe in mixed games. I think it's just more fun than there is in No Limit.
No, I think so too. I mean, no, it's fun when you're playing against people that aren't, by the book, like super by the book and doing all sorts of unusual things, for more than one reason. But yeah, I mean, the tanking is so brutal and like it's very hard to master all 11 games. So it makes there more of a game. I mean, basically, the more of the potential for skill to be in something, the more of a game there actually is. There's more potential for beta, you could say. Um, that's pretty much how it works. And yeah, I totally agree. It is a lot more fun. It's just really complicated, which is the only unfortunate downside. No Limit was a very good game until Solvers came out. One of these weird downsides of Solvers, but it was an opportunity to be capitalized in. And they could draw a pair. In my mind, there's this. This is why. I mean, a bit of a parallel. So this is how reality works the way it is, because otherwise it wouldn't be interesting.
But I'm curious on mixed games. Like, so you prefer mixed games to No Limit?
I I do if I'm playing against all the robots. But to be fair, if I'm playing against all the robots, I can become sort of like the adversary of sorts. I can. That's. I know how to. Well, I kind of know what they're. The robots do robotic things a lot of the time. It depends on which robots. Some robots are, certain people like Chidwick. He may be like the T1000, and then there's all the rusty, old-fashioned ones. You might see an I robot that they're a little bit different to handle, but they're still really boring is the problem. Like they don't do a whole lot. They just do the same thing over and over. But mixed games are definitely more fun, a lot faster, shorthanded, good stuff. I want to ask one more investment question. I got a couple other ideas before I forget. What kind of investment advice would you give to people?
Um, well, I think it needs to be pretty sort of at a pretty high level because, of course, as with anything in life, it sort of really depends on what you want to achieve and what's your financial situation like and how good are you actually at investing. But I would say um, the if you're a poker player, this probably applies to anyone, but particularly the poker player, um, you should avoid like a plague um, anything that's really illiquid.
Any what?
Anything that is really illiquid. So it means you can't.
What's
If you decide to sell tomorrow, you can't sell it unless you take a huge discount. Um,
Yeah, I made that one. I made that mistake a few times.
avoid things that are essentially even though I know people feel very gambly, the reality is you have a lot of variance already in your main job. And in investing, you probably, I mean, again, it depends on what you want. You generally shouldn't want variance, and don't invest your money in things you don't really understand. Now, you look at this company and they sell this product that you happen to get, that's not actually understanding the business. And so it's sort of a little bit like, just because you play poker in a home game, that doesn't know you actually know how to play poker. And so generally speaking, you probably don't understand how the business works, not at a level that is at which you should actually be investing money into it. And so the worst thing that can happen in a way is some guy comes to you and like, hey, I'm raising money for this thing. And you're like, oh, I know this product, or you look into it, it looks like really cool. That's probably the worst thing that you can do, because it's probably has super high volatility and high headline risk. You have adverse selection because most businesses don't fund themselves by going to poker players. Like they actually have other investor bases, meaning that
That's
they
a good
probably
point.
aren't able to get money there, so that's why they come to you. And then the worst thing is it's like really illiquid in that your money might be trapped for 3, 5, 10 years, and you certainly don't control the liquidity event. And so I've seen poker players put a lot of money into that bucket, um, which should really, if you think about your portfolio of your net worth or your liquid assets or total assets, that should really be a tiny sliver only. But yet I've seen people put in like 50% of their money into that. So that's probably the single biggest thing that you should avoid. Keep it liquid. Don't even like security select. Don't even pick. I know Tesla.
Yeah.
The best thing you can do is sort of buy some version of an index or the market, which can be just the Dow Jones or the S&P, or even like even some industry sector, but just don't. There's no reason to individually security select. In fact, you should try to keep fees low, because if like some funds, like a mutual fund, can have like an expense ratio of 1.5%, and like you can get the same thing for 0.3%. And then I would just generally just try to sort of diversify. Like you can have crypto, you can have equities, you can have real estate. But if I would try to diversify, and I would definitely try to stay away from the liquid stuff. And of course, real estate falls into that. So if you want real estate because you want to live somewhere, fine. But I think that's sort of like your mortal enemy as a poker player, is to have money trapped in something that if you needed to access it, you can't get it.
Yeah, that all seems like great advice, especially from my experience of making a lot of the mistakes that you just mentioned. Uh, yeah, I made a. I mean, one thing that I've noticed is that everyone thinks they've got the best idea and everyone thinks they're the greatest. And at some point, I just started like, well, I mean, I can't tell them that everyone says this. Well, I guess I can. I can say it on the podcast. I mean, I want to believe in people, but at the same time, everyone says this, and it's just really hard to like know the real answer. And one funny thing that I noticed is that no one ever really like compares it in comparison to all the other previous attempts or anything like that when they pitch these sorts of things, which I find to be really strange because that's what really matters is like how does what they're doing stack up in comparison to the big picture. And then often a lot of ideas that had already been thought of, or there's just like a small change in it, and there's just a lot of things that can go wrong. I
It's
find.
just super hard. I mean, the reality is, I spent 18 years of my life kind of doing it. And one thing is that for every investment that we make as a firm, and I don't make a lot of investments personally, like I probably turn down 100, just to give you maybe more.
Whoa,
And I
that's
think it's
crazy.
one thing to understand what makes for good business, and that's hard. Then it's like, how do you actually value it? Like that's another real skill. And like you got to be realistic that like unless you spend a fair bit of time doing it, you really just don't know. And so if you don't know, then go to an asset that is by nature sort of fairly priced. So, if you invest in the stock market, that's a function of supply and demand of millions and millions of people. So you don't actually have to worry in a way, is it fairly priced or not, which no one really knows, but it's sort of the best it's the best approximation like at the time, right? And so you don't have to worry about picking a good business because you just pick a basket of various businesses, right? And so, and it's you're not getting like It's a you don't have there's all kinds of other risks that you take in by investing, like fraud and counterparty risk and God knows what. Like, you don't have that if you buy it.
Yeah, yeah,
That's actually a very meaningful risk. And so, you know, and you don't really don't have the time or more likely the skill to assess that. So just keep it simple and just buy something that's available and it's at a fair price at that point in time, and the fees are low and you can sell it the next day if you want to. And you have an average return expectations of 8%. And again, you can choose things according to your risk profile. You can buy fixed income, and it guarantees you to pay 4% right now because of inflation, but you're very certain to make that return. Well, of course, in the stock market, it can go up 20, but it can also go down 15, right? But on average, it produces 8% a year.
yeah. It's definitely. I think. Um, I mean, I can't really speak for everyone, but I do think that, and I can't even speak for myself. Actually, I have a little bit, slightly different view of things, in a way of how to. I mean, for maximizing money, I mean, for sure, uh, keeping it really basic seems right. I'm surprised you don't mention REITs, real estate. What are they called? Like real estate investment.
Investment trust?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I thought
I
those.
think can be it's a good way to gain exposure to real estate as an asset class, probably better than buying real estate per se because it's liquid at least, and it can
Yeah,
be tax advantage. So you know, there's many different products out there that can cater to your investment appetite and risk profile that are available in the market. So
yeah. I read a book that kind of says what you're saying, called "The Four Pillars of Investing." It's a short book, but it basically keeps it really simple. And I've heard unconventional success is really good too. Um, and yeah, not to too much invest too much in private equity like I ended up doing. But I had a little bit of a different goal in that I personally don't view like the difference between being like having a net worth of 5 million or 10 million to be that different. Like I don't really see what the difference is, frankly. Like what the like, or even like 5 to 20. What I personally wanted to do was either like become very rich, or still be pretty rich, if that makes
mhm,
sense. Like for
mhm,
me,
mhm.
it was much more exciting, and also I could do a lot more if I had like an enormous income. So I like gambled a bit more on the whole, and also gambled a bit more of my time looking for ways to scale.
Yeah,
Uh, and so I think that, I mean, this is my like uh, fishy justification for investing in like private equity and like doing a bunch of unconventional things, but maybe it makes sense. I mean, it makes
yeah.
some sense at least. What's your
And let
professional
me guess,
opinion?
you're still fairly rich, right?
Yeah. I mean, I still want to like secure the downside, um,
Yeah,
secure like the worst case scenario kind of thing. Um, Make sure I never actually lose all my money. Don't want to do that. That's no good. But uh, try to go for the home runs. You know what I mean? Uh, what's your professional opinion on my ideas?
no, I think that's actually, that's if that's your risk profile, I think that's a very legitimate strategy. I think we can chat offline to what extent you've you've chosen the best way to implement that strategy, but I think there's nothing wrong with the strategy at all.
Yeah, I don't know about the way that I've implemented it. I'm not the best at some things, but whatever. You know, it's been life's a little bit more complicated than that, as it turns out. People don't pay you when you think for sure they'll pay you, and
Yeah,
actually, sometimes people pay you when you don't think they'll pay you. Sometimes you get cheated and they pay you back, and just weird
yeah,
stuff happens. Uh,
yeah.
I want to ask. Speaking of weird stuff, you've gone to Burning Man. It seems like I guess that fits your personality. What's your uh, what interests you about that? Is it just yeah? Tell us about that.
Well, it's interesting in that most people are very surprised that I go. So I'm not sure this. I think it fits my and my wife's personality, but we have friends that are very surprised that we go. For example, because we don't do drugs, but you don't have to if you go to Burning Man. That's kind of one of the many misconceptions. There's a. Have you been to Burning Man?
No, I want to go, but not for the reasons that are typical. And I still think that I mean, yeah, I want to go, but not for like I want to go actually related to like the whole idea of like restructuring society kind of thing, and just the whole
Mm.
experience of like, and also I'm just curious. There's all sorts of crazy stuff that happens there. Part of it is just sheer
Yeah,
curiosity, frankly.
yeah,
And
yeah.
now I'm
You
interested.
should you should definitely go. I sort of put people in three camps, which is you go and you say, I wish I hadn't gone, and maybe you even leave earlier than when you planned. Then you have a lot of people that go and they say, look, I'm glad I went, but I'm probably not going to go back. And then there's people that say, that sort of go back every year. And sort of my wife and I are somewhere between the third and the second bucket. And that sort of every year we say it's probably the last year that we go, but then we've been going for the last 5 years. But we're not sort of hardcore burners in that definition. That um, the amount of people that are in the first bucket is actually surprisingly low, but it does exist. So, and I think that what is actually so it's there's a running joke. It's very difficult to describe Burning Man to people that haven't been. Um, so it's I'm gonna probably do an awful job sort of describing it. But what we like about it is, or what I like the most about it, is that it is actually a sort of a bit of a utopian experiment, and that there's a lot of people semi like minded that build a makeshift city in the middle of the desert that lives by sort of certain principles, um, such as radical self reliance, such as radical inclusion, accepting people the way they are, such as leave no trace, which is clean up after your trash, clean up after yourself,
Isn't that still
and
self reliance?
yeah, it's. I mean, they're also connected, but meaning like you need to be able to look after yourself. But then it's also about radical inclusion, and it's also fundamentally it's a gifting festival, and so there's no commerce. Everything you either bring to look after yourself, but then also everyone has a gift to the broader society. And so it's actually both. It's both a radical self reliance, but it's also very much about taking care of other people. And so it's sort of therefore a bit of a utopian experiment, and it works incredibly well for a week. You know, I sometimes ask myself how long it would take for that whole thing to break down. But for a week, I think it's sort of mankind at its best. And a lot of it is because of positive social pressure. So imagine you come into a situation, like you come into a group of people, and everyone picks up the trash. Everyone is like really, really kind to you. No one actually treats you differently depending on how you look or where you're from or how rich or how poor you are. And you would probably sort of blend into that. And that's what I call sort of positive social pressure. And so I kind of really like what it does to me, and I think I like really what it does to human interaction. So my favorite part about Burning Man is that first of all, you get to meet great people. I met a lot of really interesting people every year, including this year, and then it allows you to connect with people at a much deeper and faster level than you sort of ever would in everyday life. And it's really different. And why is an interesting question. I think it's a lot of it is because you're in this crazy environment, like you're off the grid, you're surrounded sort of by art and nature and craziness. You don't have your cell phone doesn't work, and I think it makes those people a lot more vulnerable and open. So, for example, I was sitting like I had a I was sitting like having lunch with a guy that I knew casually, and we suddenly start talking about life, and I talk about my daughters, and he was talking about how him and his wife were having a hard time and how they struggled to have a kid, and then he just suddenly broke down crying, and like he told me kind of all these things that he probably I don't think ever admitted to someone else. Maybe he didn't even admit to himself in terms of how he's sabotaging himself and how he wished he was a different husband, and like it was just beautiful. And I started crying as well. And
So cute.
It's just human connection, like at its purest. And it's like one of my favorite moments, like over the last couple of years, just because of the human connection, and because I could relate, and I could see how it was liberating for him to talk about it. Um, and so that's just beautiful. And there's all kinds of factors in everyday life. We're too busy. We're too scared to admit weakness that prevent us from connecting that way. That's why I go to Burning Man, because the likelihood that you have these moments of small and big connections are just so much greater. Now you have to endure a lot of stuff that I really like. I don't do drugs, and like it's hot and it's dusty and it's a pain to get to, and it's the toilets just fucking give me like are just awful. Like there's all kinds of adversity that you have to endure. It's probably part of it. Like you probably can't have one without the other. But so for us, the equation has been there's enough we get out of it that it's worth making the investment. Which for us also includes it's the only weekend a year when we leave our kids. When neither of the two of us is with our kids, and we leave them with my sister-in-law, and so it's a big investment. But it is definitely worth making at least once and see if it's for you.
I definitely want to check it out. I think there's a lot of value to having the right kinds of deep connections with the right kinds of people, which it sounds like close to what I want to do. I realized it wasn't 100%, and I personally suspect it's not really perfect. But like, who am I really to say? It's just something that I happen to think about a lot, just because I think there's like really, I mean, there's just some big topics here. Um, I mean, for one thing, like the reason, at least today, like it can't be the case that people can just go on, just spout all their story. It has to be really tactical. Because if you say the wrong thing, and I've made this mistake plenty of times, people can like if you just say it even in a way that is fairly innocent in actuality, or if you just like, there's a lot of ways to shoot yourself in the foot, especially if you're a guy. I mean, if you're a girl too, but the risk payoffs are a little bit different because if you're a girl, like you could be like branded a slut or something like that, which can be quite bad. But if you're a guy and you make yourself look like you're emotionally weak, uh, I mean, there's like quite a lot at stake if you portray yourself in the wrong way, um, especially when it comes to like dealing with women, because like you have to like basically prove yourself. So, I mean, definitely judgment is a big problem in today's world. Like in Burning Man, like I don't really understand what stops people from like taking advantage in some kind of way, if that makes sense. Even if not explicitly, like there are ways of being a bad person that don't necessarily mean you have bad intentions, but you can be like a narcissist in a conversation, for example, is a really simple example. But like someone could really get off cheap in Burning Man by like barely doing anything, just like be like kind of a leech on society,
Yeah.
or they get straight up steal, and I don't really understand what the barrier to that is in Burning Man.
Well,
And
the reality is it is very interesting human experiment in that I've seen very, very little. I mean, literally shockingly little behavior that I would consider to be in any way admonishable, like free rider or being stealing, lying, being a like even just like hitting on women. So there's also this. It's like I don't think I've seen someone like hit on my wife in 5 years. It's just not that
Burning Man,
environment, and it's really interesting. And like,
in Burning
I do
Man.
think that, of course, there's mechanisms to discourage that, which is that if someone was in a camp and they would have behavior, that you and I, and certainly on a repeated basis, they just wouldn't be invited back.
Well,
They
yeah,
would
that's
probably
the
actually be ostracized in a way. And so that is what I call sort of positive context matters, right? We are different depending on context. And so you behave differently in this, like at the poker table sometimes than you do in this chat, and different than how you probably do at Burning Man. And so Burning Man brings out, I think, at least over this sort of week long period, it brings out the best in people. I think if you let the experiment run for several months, I think I don't think it'll actually work. even though it's exactly the same people. And so, but it is really interesting. I mean, I'm not surprised by it. I'm surprised about the extent that, I see a very large group of people, 70,000, over a moderately extended period of time, kind of adhere to certain principles of behavior and interaction. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, well, that's what intrigues me about it. I mean, it's one thing to experience it. Also, I mean, I think part of the reason this thing works is literally because it was like put out there. Hey, we're gonna all be this way, and it just attracted those kinds of people. It became like it started as this like niche thing. And this is, by the way, how movements start to a degree. There's always like the first movers. Basically, all the first movers just like said, hey, we're just gonna go to this place and do this. Uh, so it's like pretty good in that sense, I think. I mean, enters the realm of something that I don't really understand fully. I just imagine it to be really complicated, but from my perspective, it has a lot of the right elements of, you know, positive society transformation. But I imagine
Yeah.
that's like really
You would get a lot
complicated.
out of it, right? That I'm sure, given kind of where I know that your interests lie, and you're right that the fear is at some point it gets so big that it sort of collapses under its own weight. And yeah, I mean, I think if you double and triple it and quadruple it, like at some point, I don't think the experience that I've had the last 5 times I went would be the same anymore. But also, it hasn't happened so far. Like, it's not like last year was no different than it was 5 years before that, or this year was no different than the first time I went. But at some point, that's probably the case.
But yeah, I do want to check out Burning Man. I'll leave us with one final thing. Actually, I'll leave you with a challenge of sorts.
Geez.
I know that you have been known to like pop your chest a little bit. I made the mistake of not being able to pop my chest now. I think you would actually win right now, but I'm aiming to try to be able to compete with you to to get a good chest off going. Um, and I need to get a little skinnier, which is the plan. But yeah, just keep that in mind next time you're going to be popping the chest off the table. And by the way, I had a dream that you like beat me for like at the final table of poker. I remember this. It was like kind of a frustrating dream. But
That's
I would
amazing
like.
because you're very clairvoyant and in terms of seeing into the future, and me beating you is definitely part of my plan as well,
All
especially
right.
after you
Well.
took me out of the PPC last summer. Um, so I'm looking forward to the chest off. I'm looking forward to beating your ass next time we're heads up.
All right. Well, as long as I win the chest off, I'm pretty happy. I think if I get second place in the tournament, so I'll take it. I'll take second place to the Mannheim. Uh, I mean, I'll take first place too, but um, something like this could happen. Yeah, I want the chest off trophy at least. I mean, that's at least like there's not too much variance in that, I guess. Or I don't know. Whatever. Just be prepared, buddy.
Good luck, Jungle.
All right. Well, thank you for your time and for being on the podcast. It's been great, Mister Mannheim, Eurotrash, uh, Burning Man Trash, uh, Prince Philip. I'll see you in Bobby's room with limited buttons on your shirt. And yeah, good luck.
All right, take care, Jungle.